Hello, everybody. Welcome to the dialogue on perspectives on society after COVID-19, jointly organized by Princeton University and Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo. I'm HANEDA Masashi, director of Tokyo College and moderator of today's session. Princeton and UTokyo have a long history of collaboration in various fields. You can see a part of the history by watching the first video of this series, that is a dialogue between Provost Prentice and Executive Vice President Aihara. Using some pictures and texts, I introduced a brief history of our long and friendly partnership there. We planned dialogues of this time on the basis of this long partnership. Faculties of two universities will exchange ideas and information on their specific research field from various, and discuss on the society after COVID-19 from various perspectives. Today, I have two eminent sociologists with me, Professor James RAYMO of Princeton University and Professor SHIRAHASE Sawako of the University of Tokyo. Let me introduce them very briefly. Professor RAYMO is professor of sociology and Henry Wendt III Professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton University. He's a social demographer and interested in the causes and potential consequences of demographic changes associated with population aging in Japan. He wrote his master's thesis in Japanese at Osaka City University and has visited various Japanese universities since then, including the University of Tokyo. He serves as the responsible person of the strategic partnership between Princeton and UTokyo at Princeton side. Usually he works as a moderator with me, but today he plays a role of speaker. And Professor SHIRAHASE Sawako is a professor of sociology at the School of Humanities and Sociology at the University of Tokyo. She is interested in social stratification, social demography, and change in family and social system. She served as an executive vice president of the University of Tokyo in 2019 and 20. And if my understanding is correct, she will be a vice president of the United Nations University and a vice president of the International Science Council soon. She is also responsible person of the UTokyo Center for Contemporary Japanese Studies. So very important person. So both work in the field of social demography, that in particular that of Japanese society. But we will have one more dialogue on the demography itself. And today, Professor RAYMO and SHIRAHASE will focus on gender inequality. I look forward to hearing, listening to their view on this very important point in Japanese and global society after COVID-19 crisis. So dear colleagues, good morning or good evening. I asked several questions one by one to you, but using my question as a starting point, I expect you to have a free discussion on any issue you are interested in. Okay?
Sure.
Right. Anyway, thank you very much for your collaboration. And my first question is like this. It is often said that the impact of the pandemic has worse for women than for men. What is the evidence of this gender difference in Japan and the United States? Can I ask this question first to Jim?
Sure, thank you. Before responding, let me just say I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to participate in this. As Masashi said, I'm usually his co-conspirator, collaborator as a moderator of the dialogues, but it's a real pleasure today to be on the other side, so to speak, because I get to talk about things I'm interested in, but much more importantly, I get to talk about them with my longtime friend and colleague, Professor Shirahase Sawako. I will, since I always call you Sawako, I will call you Sawako today. It is really an honor to be here and to share thoughts with you. So thank you. With respect to the question, yeah, this is really interesting because at least in the United States, previous sort of economic downturns, sharp economic downturns, have been particularly rough on men. However, it's pretty clear from the research and certainly a lot of the media treatment that the impact of the pandemic and the associated changes in the economy have been really strong for women relative to men. And there are some, in English, at least in the press here, there are a couple of terms that are widely used. It's often called the gendered pandemic, or even more creatively, a she-cession as opposed to a recession, emphasizing the fact that it's been particularly, the economic changes have been particularly detrimental to women's well-being. So I've mentioned the economy a couple of times. We can talk more in more detail about specifics, but I think in addition to the differential economic impact, it's pretty clear that there have been real differences between men and women in terms of the impact with respect to work-family balance, the impact of additional childcare or other kinds of caregiving have fallen primarily on women's shoulders. And I think that that's another particularly important aspect of the inequality. And the other thing that is particularly interesting to me right now, and I hope we can talk a little bit more about this as we go on, is the differential impact in mental health or psychological well-being, subjective well-being, which seems to be really quite pronounced, with women faring far less well than men on a lot of different measures of emotional, psychological well-being. So those are just a few of the things that we see a lot of here in the press and in the related scientific literature. So I'll love to hear what Sawako has to say about things in Japan.
Okay. First of all, I also like to show my gratitude to be invited in such exciting events. And thank you very much, Professor Haneda. Haneda Sensei, I can't call him the first name actually in a Japanese context.
So far as we speak in English, call each other in first name, no problem.
Okay, okay, that's
I'll call you Sawako.
Okay, that's
so
great.
Call me Masashi.
Okay, that's nice. Yeah. And thank you, Masashi. And I feel so honored to be here, and particularly I very much looking forward to exchange of ideas. And then again, Jim is a very long time respectful, my colleague. He has helped us, actually, our team pretty much. Okay, and returning to the first question, and this question is quite common from sociological perspective, because if we got some kind of this kind of disastrous event, social vulnerable people are more likely get higher impact, higher negative impact. This is a quite common situation, and from the sociological perspective. But at this point, actually, in Japan, they finally aware how disadvantageous they are, and looking at the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, because COVID-19 pandemic, affects the most the arena where a lot of women are working, particularly as non-regular, for instance, part-time workers. So they are quite unstable in the labor market. So that is one of the evidence actually of the situation. And how much I can measure the evidence, that's the very important and crucial question to be asked. And you can get a lot of evidences, and but then we don't have single one indices, a single one measurement how serious we are. So in other words, even though we discuss men and women on average are different, and the women are more likely get more negative impact on average, but within, the women and within men, there are a kind of differentiation in the degree of the impact. But again, Japan has been characterized very, disadvantageous position of women. So luckily and unluckily, this kind of situation finally exposed to the society. So we do need urgent action against it. And referring to another point, referring to what Jim said, psychological, mental type of problems are also very much important. We can't ignore it. So definitely there is a lack of the research on this area, unfortunately, and particularly in Japan. So that's I really I like to study from the States, and I like to learn more from the American side. Thank you.
If I can just follow up with one thing that you mentioned there at the end, Sawako, which I think is tremendously interesting, because as I've told you, I'm working primarily on a study on the impact of COVID and associated changes, lockdown, et cetera, in Japan, but also I'm obviously doing a lot of reading in the US. And one of the things that's really there's a lot of similarities, obviously.
Yeah.
But one of the things that's really quite different is the very often discussed in the media rise in suicide rates among women in Japan. Obviously, a very, very extreme measure of impact on emotional well-being. And that we don't really see in the US. So I hope at some point, if not now, at some point, we can talk a little bit more about why that might be.
Sure. Can I
please,
ask you very briefly? Okay, the overall number of this, people who committed suicide are larger among men than among women. But point is, the difference in the number before the COVID-19 and after COVID-19 is larger, and higher among women than among men. And the other thing is one of the peculiar situation on this, the negative impact of COVID-19 is that not only the woman who live alone, but also who live with somebody, committed suicide. This is one situation which I'm very much worried about. And the other thing is some teenagers, high school girls, also the number of them are, I can see the substantial number. Of course, this is absolute number is less than 100, but still within the August or so, this number, we can't ignore it. So the situation we can, is very serious if we think about what is going on under the COVID-19. For instance, one of the peculiar situations related to COVID-19 pandemic is that we tend to be isolated at home. So at home should be the so-called intimate, sphere in Japan. And the family, as you know, is the basis of, livelihood security for everybody. But now there is no guarantee that the family can function to protect basic livelihood security services. So there's someone within the family, they're suffering from domestic violence. And unfortunately, some of the girls, got pregnant without their wish. So this kind of numbers are increasing, but unfortunately, absolute number of these victims is much, much higher in the United States. So, of course, that might be the change or how much we can see on media, then everybody is struck by the fact. But the thing is, again, this kind of undesirable situation has been already existed in Japan, and the absolute number of these victims are much smaller, at least compared with the United States. But again, we have very common, serious, problems in Japan under COVID-19.
Yeah, the point you make, Sawako, about domestic violence, that's another thing that we forgot to mention in response to Masashi's initial question. I mean, that's powerful evidence of the differential impact on men and women of the pandemic and largely reflection. I don't actually know, but I assume it to be a reflection of a combination of stress and more time at home and unable to avoid these kinds of toxic relationships. Yeah.
And furthermore, we are the social scientists, of course, the sociology. But again, we do need the evidence, actually, scientific evidence, what's going on in Japan. So that situation also, we are very much behind. So in the United States, a lot more, number of the research on this area based on some basic data more often be done. But then in Japan, we do need this kind of, data set to be available for, social science people. That's I'd like to, emphasize, sometimes during our talk.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited. Oh, please, go ahead.
Please. Why these data are not available in Japan? The data itself is ready, or they didn't correct at all the data?
This is a quite fundamental and a very long-term problems. And statistic law in Japan is pretty much restricted for outsiders to so-called analyze the data. So even though we're imported the important meaning of evidence-based policy making, we do not have enough secured access to the various data for everybody, like including Jim. And Jim is working on Japan and a Japan specialist, but he's living outside. But we do need an international colleague to working together. But we have a very strict limitation to have access to the data set. And one problem is privacy. Of course, the government has to protect the privacy for the people. And that's why the education is very much, ethical education to handle this kind of data is crucial, of course. But, data-based research, unfortunately, we haven't, reached some desirable levels to Japan. And the medical data is also very early stage to sharing the data, unfortunately. But now it's international global movement is much move faster. So
so the data are there, but they are not open. That is the situation in Japan. Am I right?
Two things: they are not open, but they are not create the data. Taking into account apply usage later on. So we do need to create a data set, of course, so that we can analyze. So there's a really long history. But then once in order to collect, when we collect the data, we have to take into account, many people can use this kind of very important data to assess a kind of, impact of the policies and to find out what's going on.
In the US, so the data is open in principle.
Yeah, a quick follow-up on that. Yeah, these are all really good points. And I think I would really strongly second what Sawako just said about the difficulty of accessing government collected data, which in many cases is of the highest quality. Having said that, though, I do think that there are a lot of groups that have been very active in collecting really quite useful data, and interested in sharing them. I'm involved in a couple of projects with people at different places in Japan who are collecting really quite interesting data on the impact of COVID, the pandemic, particularly around education and employment, but in the context of long-running surveys. Right. So the ability to sort of see what was happening before, during, and after is a really powerful analytical lever that we need to have. And fortunately, people are collecting that. I think one difference really might be, and this is a difference of degree, I think, more than anything, the government here, the National Institutes of Health in particular, are funneling vast amounts of research money to researchers to collect data or to integrate COVID modules into existing data collection efforts. So I'm going to get, and those data are typically available to most researchers with some small delay, perhaps. So I think that maybe one difference. Again, a matter of degree rather than a difference in the fundamental arrangements.
Yeah, and following that, actually, I don't mean that, say, the United States open to the data to everybody.
No,
That's not
no.
true. No, not at all, actually.
Yeah.
Every country has a very strict rules to have an access to the data. But again, if the more government and understandable for doing the solid research internationally, then we may have more to be done. So that we can collaborate more easily. That's all I want to say. And furthermore, Japan has a peculiar history on the data usage as well. And so in that sense, I don't mean that we have nothing and other countries having all. That's not true. But I don't want you to misunderstand.
No. I'm agreeing with everything you said, Sawako.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
But anyway, this point should be noted. And this is a very helpful evidence to think about the relation between the government and social scientists, or even scientists, the politics and scientists. Certainly, we need to get more trust from the government side, certainly. Yeah. And the next question I wanted to ask you has been already touched by both of you, but I will nevertheless ask the second question. What are some of the explanations for these gender differences in the impact of the pandemic? It's a little bit vague question, but anyway, Jim, please.
Sure. So we could probably stay here for 2 or 3 hours talking about the various explanations. So maybe an easy way to think about this, I've been thinking about this in the context of a paper I'm working on right now with a couple of students on Japan, as I mentioned, about the greater loss among women than men of ikigai during the pandemic. And something that we didn't touch on, but another very interesting measure of psychological well-being. And in that, we've tried to sort of synthesize the existing literature and existing research in terms of its explanations into 3 different groups, one of which we're sort of calling baseline differences. So differences between men and women prior to the pandemic. We've already talked about the higher representation of women in non-standard work, particularly in Japan. Another example is the higher representation in the service industry, which of course has been hit much harder. Higher representation in healthcare and other kinds of care work. Much higher levels of responsibility for childcare. All of these are what we think about as sort of baseline differences that have that structure the impact of the pandemic on the lives of men and women in different ways. And then the second sort of bucket of explanations, which are very closely related to the first, are differences between men and women in the experiences during the pandemic. So we've already mentioned that women have been more likely to lose their jobs, to have large drops in income, to experience conflictual relationships and be the one who bears the brunt of that, to face the difficulties of balancing work and family in the context of school closings and so on. So there's a lot of ways in which the pandemic has impacted the lives of men and women, independent, or maybe not independent, but in addition to their baseline differences. And then the third sort of bucket of factors that we've been looking at or thinking about, or we see a lot in the literature at least, are the differences between men and women and how they respond to the stressors in the pandemic. This may sound a little bit too essentialist or reductionist for some people, but I think there's plenty of evidence that women take the pandemic more seriously. There's more fear among women. Women respond in ways that with respect, for example, to stay-at-home orders or to social distancing orders that may have stronger implications for their social interactions, implications for isolation relative to men who may be less likely to follow the guidelines. So those are the sort of three different groups that we've tried to make sense of these, you know, many explanations that are out there.
Sawako, please.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I do agree in the three, you know, factors and aspects to for the, you know, impact for the COVID-19 pandemic is quite, you know, widely, you know, known and discussed. But I think the most important, you know, factors to explain the gender difference in terms of the degree of impact of COVID-19 is gender imbalance in various ways. So I think it's, you know, gender imbalance and industrial distribution among workers, or, you know, gender imbalance or gender gap in the, you know, role allocation within the family. So in other words, maybe the difference in experiences are the most important, you know, factors to explain the gender differences. So then about the third point, which Jim pointed was, you know, women are, you know, feel more about the negative impact of COVID-19, and women are more sensitive towards this kind of stress. That I really do not know. I try to explain because then, even though I take into account all the difference in, you know, numbers in the household work, and but then these differences are not that much. I can't still see a kind of a difference. So I really can't, you know, haven't to find out what's going on, but to see the degree of involvement in the daily life is quite different, even in the United States, and even in the North America or France or some, you know, Northern Europe. So the men and women live differently, and maybe in the Northern Europe, there's some commonly or sharing some basic time. But then particularly in Japan, the men and women live very differently, spend differently. So this kind of cumulative experiences before the COVID-19 affects the most. And furthermore, the COVID-19, you know, affected most negatively to some certain area, again, where the women are working at work, actually. So this kind of combination makes the things more worse. So in my point is the gender imbalance in the different ways, how to spend the time and how much involved in various, you know, daily activities, you know, makes the difference, gender difference in the impact of COVID-19 clearer. So that's my that's I'm thinking.
Brings to mind a couple of points, if I can, I'd like to share. I think that really, if I can put a term on what you're talking about, Sawako, which I think is right on target, okay, is something that comes up a lot in the research, not just on the pandemic, the current pandemic, but on other disasters, natural disasters, pandemics, and so on. And that is that these times of crisis and stress, unusual crisis and stress, are often maybe like a magnifying glass on existing inequalities,
right?
And they just magnify literally
the
existing differences and their implications. So I think that that's a really important point. And the other thing that I think that you mentioned that really resonates with me in terms of some of the work that we've been doing is the differences in the way that men and women structure their lives. And if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'll share an interesting finding from our paper that I mentioned that looks at the loss of ikigai before and after the pandemic. And this is a really interesting survey shared by people collecting data in Japan.
Sure.
Yeah. And it talks about ikigai from family, from work, and from social life, leisure life. And men and women aren't very different in terms of having or losing ikigai from family or work. It's the social part,
right?
Where the real gender difference in the loss of this. I realize it. I'm using this term as if everybody knows it, and I shouldn't. Something like meaning of life, purpose in life, commitment, sense of satisfaction, achievement, or something like that. All of that, I think, is folded into the term ikigai, but really it's the social part where we see the big difference. So that really is some empirical evidence based on national data that really supports the point you were making, I think, Sawako.
Yes. And furthermore, the gender difference is very important, but in terms of the perception of the reality, is very much affected by the difference is education. So highly educated, man, highly educated person, no matter man or woman, are more likely, feel more worried for the future, something like that. So I didn't see any interaction and, effects on that aspect, but not only the gender, but also so-called social, economic background, particularly educational level is pretty much, affected how how much people feel, or how much worried they are. So the highly educated people tend to be very worried for the future. But on the other hand, this is also very classic, sociology. But less, less wealthy people just satisfied, as it is actually at this point. But highly educated, people can postpone their own pleasure, and so in other words, they tend to be worried many things.
That's the point I wanted to ask both of you later, because we have been discussing on the difference between men and women, but there are many other differences in society, rich and poor, ethnic difference, or education difference, etc. And from this perspective, the discussion focusing only on the difference between men and women, is it very effective or effective to solve the social questions or issues? How do you think about this?
No, that's a really good point. I have to. Can I?
Please,
actually, for instance, that's also the 1980s. That's a very active argument. Gender or class difference are more important to see the society. And my mentor and John Goldthorpe, kept saying that class is the is a core of structure of the society. But again, then whether you're a man or woman has a different experiences in daily life. That means role expectation towards outside are pretty much different between men and women. However, these kind of differences are pretty much closely related to the social economic background and the background. So for instance, COVID-19 and first in New York, for instance, there are much more difference and effect, or how much they are affected, these kind of differences, and then depending on the social status or economic status, for the woman, for people more likely to get infected because their way of the sanitary situation are less desirable, and no matter whether man or woman. So this man and woman is very important, one criteria, but it's not all. So we are social beings. So that's a really, really important point I'd like to say.
Yeah, and I would agree with everything you said, and would go even further to say I think that we're separating them here just for convenience. I think these are inseparable dimensions of inequality, gender, and in the United States, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic circumstances. And I think artificially just focusing on one will miss a lot of what's really important, I think, in terms of the broader policy issues and impact on inequality that you're talking about. In the US, for example, you can't talk about race and ethnicity and income or other measures of socioeconomic status separately. And then when we think about differences between men and women or within the same sex, gender, you have to think about differences by race and ethnicity. I think it's easy to find clear empirical evidence that at least not with respect to the infection or mortality, which has been worse for poor racial ethnic minority men. The other impacts of COVID that we've been talking about, economic, family, social, and so on, have clearly been worse for low income racial and ethnic minority women. So I think you really need to think about these as sort of intersecting dimensions of inequality if we really want to have a full understanding. So that's a great question.
The question, the problem is not very simple, certainly.
No.
Yeah, I understand.
No, that's why we keep working, actually.
If it was, there would be a Nobel Prize for sociologists.
Yeah. But there's no Nobel Prize, Jim, unfortunately.
No, I know. I'm just joking.
The time is now running out. The next question is that this point as well, Sawako has already touched it, but nevertheless, I want to ask this question. Is the differential impact of the pandemic on women something unique? Or is it just an extension of existing inequalities between men and women? What do you think about this, Jim?
Yeah, so this goes back to the point about the magnifying glass, which I think is really, I mean, it may be a little artificial, but I think it's really insightful to think about the ways in which stress, extreme circumstances allow us to see more clearly things that have always been there. That's not to say that there haven't been specific gender differentiated impacts of the pandemic itself, but I think to a large degree, I think we're in agreement that that this is a reflection of inequalities that have always been there. I think it's no surprise, or it shouldn't be a surprise, that things are unfolding as they are with respect to differences between men and women in terms of their well-being. I'll throw out just since we're both social scientists, sociologists, I'll throw out something that I think would be really a powerful way to leverage the kinds of things that we have in our toolbox at our disposal to empirically answer that question. I hope in a convincing way. It takes time. But that is to sort of adopt what sociologists might call a life course approach, or a cohort approach, and observe what happens to men and women over the course of the next 15, 20 years, depending on how they experience the pandemic, and to see whether or not the same kinds of inequalities that we've been observing across the life courses of men and women for decades play out similarly for the people who've experienced the pandemic in this way or in different ways. And I think that would be one way to generate some kind of leverage that would help us answer the question, is this unique or is this just a replication? I'm pretty sure that the answer is going to be it's both, a replication of existing inequalities and something unique, just given the severity and the prolonged nature of the situation that we're in. So that's my 2 cents on this one. That's a tough question.
Yeah, it's tough.
What do you think, Sawako?
Yeah, thank you. I do agree, Jim, actually, overall. So the overall pattern of the, impact or negative impact of pandemic is, is quite, common or similar, I think. However, John, a detailed patterns or timings or degree might be might be differ by nation or by time.
Right.
So, and why the difference? That's our job. So that's, trying to explain. For instance, the degree of the, the degree of the number of growth of, people in the community suicide are larger in Japan than the United States, for instance. Then why this is a difference? That's a core question, research question to be asked. So overall, the current impact of pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic is a consequences of already existed inequality, and inequality structure and more or less similarly found grow in globe, I think to some extent.
Yeah.
But again, the pattern or degree are pretty much different. That's the most important target which we're working on. So the why the different is really, really important indeed to see. So this is a kind of very good empirical work to explain why we're different. At the same time, we share the similar structure or some similar inequality background. So I think I do agree with Jim's question answer. Thank you.
Okay, so we have analyzed and examined a lot the current situation in the society under the COVID-19. But let's talk the future.
Yeah.
We understand that there are many questions, problems to be solved, to solve, but to get to get a better future for not only women but also men, what kind of measures should we take right now from the perspective of sociologists? This is a question I asked at first to Jim.
Yeah. So this is a interesting and obviously critically important question. And for those of you who follow political news in the United States, you'll know that this is probably I guess one of the main topics of discussion right now, given the current makeup of the Congress and the president. I think there's a widely shared sense that the needs and the barriers to well-being that may be particularly salient for women that have been magnified, to use our word, by the pandemic are really part of the policy discussion right now. So for example, higher wages. We have incredibly low minimum wage. Japan does too. So in terms of providing living wage, in terms of providing more job stability, in terms of providing more support for people who lose their jobs in extreme circumstances like this, particularly for providing better childcare that will allow women to balance work, and men and women obviously, but it particularly is appear to affect women more. So facilitating work-family balance by providing better childcare. All of these things are on the table as policy changes. These are all areas in which the US is particularly unusual in terms of its limited support, extremely limited support relative to other countries. Japan is not so good on these either, but better than the United States. But as I said, these are all part of these large so-called infrastructure bills that are being discussed right now. I don't think we would be having this discussion if the pandemic hadn't happened and again, sort of magnified these problems and made it clear that these are relevant for everybody, regardless of your socioeconomic background, regardless of where you live, and so on. Will it happen? I'm usually a glass half full person, an optimist by nature. But the functioning of the U.S. government gives me little reason to be optimistic. So I don't know. Maybe we'll have a little bit of success on some of these measures, but I think those are the ones that are going to get the most discussion, the ones that I just mentioned.
Okay. All right. Actually, I also basically a very optimistic person. That's why I kept saying, society can be better. But the thing is, current situation is a kind of social shock. So no matter how poor you are, how wealthy you are, you under this pandemic. But at the same time, how to cope with this kind of social shock, differ by the degree of resources you have, what kind of, degree of networks you have. So this is quite, inequality issues and then coming up again, to us actually. So this is quite, a good occasion to face our unequal society. And how much unequal we are tolerated, people like to, focus on this issue. However, I don't think it's a good idea that particularly the younger people do not have any guarantee, to have an equal opportunity to access the next step. In other words, this is one of the serious situation for the younger people is a so-called generational justice type of problems. And some people who were born in a particular, time, say for instance, in this last 2 years, people suffer the most. For instance, when you were supposed to start your new job, you were supposed to enter the college, you were start to looking for the job, and then pandemic came to us. So these, some bunch of the people have highly disadvantageous situation there no matter what. So this is not their fault, actually, nobody's fault. But we have to, help each other and maybe redistribute our risk, social risk to, among us. So that's why this kind of issues are very important and very urgent as well, because Japan States is also very peculiar. I have to confess. I don't think she is, model country, but a very dynamic. And personally, I like this country very much. But at the same time, there are huge problems out there. And in Japan also, Japan has the better aspect and worse aspect than US. But at the same time, gender gap has lasted such a long time. Yeah. Even though we achieved industrialization first in Asia, in the 1960s, but still gender relations are quite, static. So this is quite peculiar. And that's why there's some kind of, consequences and getting very, very serious. In other words, how to cope with this kind of, unexpected, huge, problems. It is, needs some, very, very large kind of measurement of policies. We got to do something quite rational and quite innovative. Other than that, society will be, will get more unequal and get more polarized and get more unhappy as, overall. So it's really urgent. That's, I have to keep, I like to keep saying that. And the government and people also working together, and different kinds of stakeholders has to, work together. And the international global collaboration is the key, I have to say, to combat and tackle this kind of common risk. But in Japan are not good at that. That's really, she's not good at this kind of aspects. But that's aspect we have to work together and making it improved. And that's now is the situation. That's, I think.
Thank you. I wanted to point out that point, that important point, the inequality in the world. Certainly, we have discussed a lot on Japan, gender inequality in Japan and in the US, but we need to talk on the not gender, but nation inequality in the world, maybe. And we will have another session on this topic, international affairs, in the framework of dialogues between Princeton and UTokyo, certainly. So this issue, this is very important, but we will have another time to discuss. Now the time is running out, but I ask you the final comments. If you have some questions, comments, or remarks at this point, please tell us. Jim, you have something to say at the end of your dialogue.
Yeah, I would just like to say again, thank you for the opportunity. This is, again, I'm on the other side of the camera today, so to speak, and look forward to being back on the other side with you for the next dialogue. But this has been a great opportunity to think hard about some of the things that are structuring my work. I've, as you and Sawako mentioned, been studying Japan for decades. That sounds weird, but yes, for decades. And of course, gender inequality has always been a central focus, as it really has to be, I think, if you're a demographer or a social scientist interested in inequality in Japan or East Asia. So this is really a good opportunity to think hard with Sawako and with you, Masashi, about some of these issues. I appreciate the opportunity and very much look forward to talking more with both of you about these and other kinds of issues that we're all interested in when the time comes and we can see each other in person. Thank you.
Time was.
Okay, thank you. Can I say,
yeah, of course. Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me, and truly I enjoyed very much. Such a nice moderator, Masashi, and that's a great question. All questions are quite good and important, and I very much appreciate you give me such a great opportunity to talk. It's always nice to talk to Jim, of course, but in this kind of situation is quite unusual for us. So this is good, so we can do it again, maybe.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if the situation is good enough, Jim will visit us certainly next year and stay for some time at Tokyo College. Let's hope so.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lively discussion today. And we have other sessions of dialogue between Princeton and UTokyo. So let's enjoy all these discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you.